I'm a pretty big fan of Rareware, more specifically the Nintendo 64 era of Rareware, with a little Super Nintendo splashed in. I'd go as far to say they're my favorite developer of all time. One day I hope to have covered all of their N64 games in some fashion, but that's later down the road. While I am a huge fan of theirs, I don't have much of any experience with their games after the N64. After Microsoft got Rare, I didn't really pay attention to them. I heard about some games they made, but with how bitter people got about post-N64 Rare, all I really heard was bad things about them. I don't think I need to repeat what people have said about Nuts and Bolts, Perfect Dark Zero, or Conquer Live and Reloaded, but I also heard some bad things about another game they made, the first Rare game published by Microsoft for the Xbox, Grabbed by the Ghoulies. Now, I've heard bad things about this game, but mostly just that it wasn't all that good without going into the specifics. I've also admittedly wrote this game off because other people said it wasn't good, and I was also a bit bitter about the buyout. But I eventually got over it and got a little curious about this game. I mean, I didn't know anything about it aside from a couple aspects of it. Could it really be that bad? Rareware was on top of the world during the N64. It's not like all that talent just got switched off the moment Microsoft bought them and they couldn't make good games anymore. And also, I'm quite familiar with people unjustly overblowing problems with and overhating actually really good Rareware games, so why would this game be any different? I recently was able to play this game for the first time, so let's take a look at Grabbed by the Ghoulies. Can I just say this has to be one of the best title screens in any game? It's so good. First time I turned this on, I just stayed here and let it go until it restarted. This game has already given a pretty good first impression. The story of this one is pretty simple, but it does have that usual Rare charm to it. It starts with Cooper and his girlfriend Amber lost in the woods at night during a storm. They come across an old house. Amber wants to take refuge inside, but unbeknownst to them, this place is Ghoulies Hall. And its owner, Baron von Ghoul, notices them approaching, wanting them to come in to be part of his collection. Cooper is hesitant to go in, saying that old houses like these tend to be full of creeps, and the Baron hears this and gets offended. So he brings a couple statues to life to kidnap Amber, and Cooper follows to save her. Upon entering the manor, Cooper finds himself being stared down by numerous glowing eyes from the shadows. And then this old man enters the room wondering what the noise is, and when he turns on the lights, we see the ghoulies that were surrounding Cooper. The old man runs off, but gives Cooper some support by telling him how to fight them, as well as giving him a chair to fight with. Once the ghoulies are all dealt with, the old man comes back and introduces himself. This is Crivens, the butler of Ghoulies Hall, and he is willing to help Cooper save Amber. This game is divided into 5 chapters. For Chapter 1, all Cooper does is pursue and try to save Amber with the help of Crivens. He gets close to saving her a couple times, but a couple traps keep them separated, until eventually Crivens himself finally sets her free. Though the moment is cut short when Dr. Crackpot appears and uses this ray gun to turn Amber into a ghoulie. The mission now is to turn her back to normal. This is when you start to run into the other residents of Ghoulies Hall. Crivens points you to the cook, 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺, who can make a potion to cure Amber, but needs 3 special ingredients that you have to find across the mansion. Along the way, you run into other residents of the hall, like Mr. Ribs, who at first you think is an enemy because he takes one of the ingredients from you, but it turns out he's 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺's assistant who was only trying to help. There's also Fiddlesworth Dunfiddlin, the groundkeeper, and Barbara Buffbrass, the cleaning lady. These are fun characters, even if they don't do a lot, though they do show up from time to help you, although Babs is more reluctant most of the time since it'll lead to her having to clean up the mess. Fiddlesworth tends to start his sentences by saying stuff like, "Mow my meadow," or "Crunch my carrots." It's pretty amusing. Cooper even attempts to do it at one point. But after getting all the ingredients, Ma gives you the antidote. But right when you give it to Amber, Ma realizes she mixed up one of the ingredients. which means Amber turns into an even bigger ghoulie. Fortunately, before things get too bad, Ma gets there with a real antidote. With Amber back to normal, they're free to leave, but before they do, Mr. Ribs urges them to stay so they can free the other teens that the Baron has captured. Cooper decides to help and goes to 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺, who tells him that the only way to free them is with a key that the Baron himself has. But his quarters is locked up by a magic seal that can only be broken by reciting a special rhyme. This rhyme was written down, but the Baron has confiscated it and split it into 3 pieces and hid them across the mansion. One of them is held by Dr. Crackpot, but he gets defeated easily, and we don't get much of him. I think he's responsible for all the ghoulies, but he's hardly even in the game. Anyways, Cooper finds them all and then recites it in front of the door to the Baron's quarters. In my room I do hide a surprise, but the secret's not for anyone's eyes. Check the flaps, A-OK, spin the prop, chucks away. Faster down the runway we go, let's stick to the skies, tally-bally-o. Cooper enters the room and quite the surprise awaits him. He sees 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺 beating up the Baron. He then is about to hand you the key, but right before he does, he hits you with it and reveals that he was actually the Baron the whole time. What? Baron von Ghoul is a really fun but underutilized villain. He's just this crazy dude in his pajamas that acts really silly, but he's still powerful, wielding magic and commands an army of ghoulies. He doesn't really have a grand goal, he's just a bad guy who likes to kidnap people and play sick games on them. He's not taking any of this seriously, but he is a serious threat to you. This twist is great because it shows that you have not actually been thwarting him at all. You've only got this far because the Baron himself led you there. This has just been a game for him. He's the puppet master, and you're the puppet. If Baron von Ghoul had more screen time, he could have been up there with Gruntilda or King K. Rool in terms of being a great and memorable villain. He makes the most of his limited time. The twist is great and gives a new perspective on the whole game, and he does have this looming presence the entire time, similarly to Gruntilda. Though his presence is actually tied to the gameplay, which I'll go over later. It's just we don't see enough of this guy. But anyways, Baron von Ghoul did make one mistake, and that was leading you to him. Even with his secret weapon, the Red Baron, Cooper still defeats him, partly because he gave you a weapon to make the fight more fair, but Cooper boots him out the window, freeing Ghoulhaven Hall from his influence. The other characters who worked in the house are no longer hostages, and with the key, Cooper and Mr. Ribs save all the trapped teens. But before they can leave, Cooper gets knocked out by some ghoulies. Luckily, Ma 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺 comes to the rescue, and the game ends with Cooper and Amber leaving for a nearby town. As I said, it has a simple story, but it has that Rareware charm, and the characters are pretty fun if simple, or underutilized in the Baron's case. But there really isn't much more to be said on the story, so let's take a look at the visuals. This game looks pretty good. Rare has always been good with visuals, and this is no exception. Everything is cartoony and exaggerated, but done in an appropriately spooky style. I'm a sucker for spooky atmospheres, whether done in a serious or silly manner, so this game hits all the right notes for me. It's not a scary game at all, but it still has a great atmosphere to it that just screams Halloween. Similarly to Luigi's Mansion, the whole game takes place in one big house, but there's still variety in the locations as you progress through each other room. Each chapter will take you to different areas of the mansion, and the different paths you go along are pretty distinct. Gotta appreciate how detailed each room is. Makes this place feel lived in, even if most of the residents are dead. It's also pretty cool seeing all the stuff in the Baron's room to give him even more character. Character designs are pretty good as well. I like how the imps are basically just Jinjos. Oh, and the skeletons are great. I love their animations. I mentioned it before, but I love how the Baron is just in his pajamas. Really shows how little of a threat he sees you, not even gonna get dressed to fight you. The cutscenes are presented in this interesting, somewhat comic book panel style, although it's in a regular book instead. It's neat and gives the game its own charm, but the panels can be a little small, and all the dialogue happens in its own panel instead of with the animations. Kinda reminds me of silent movies, actually, which is probably intentional. Right, well, I'm running out of things to say. Game looks good, I don't know what you want from me. The soundtrack is also pretty good. I already mentioned the title theme, which is amazing, and that theme pops up throughout the game. it's instantly recognizable as Grant Kirkhope's work. I don't usually mention the composers when talking about music, but he's my favorite, so it's hard for me not. It's not my favorite soundtrack he's made, but it's still pretty good. I like how the whole thing is spooky themed. It really contributes to the atmosphere. There are several battle themes, which is good given the type of game this is. My favorite track has to be Baron von Ghoulies Phase 1. It's a good listen. I never really hear people bring up the soundtrack at all, which is a shame. It's pretty underrated. But, onto the gameplay. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is a 3D beat-em-up. Interesting how the first 3D beat-em-up they made was something original, and not like a Battletoads game. But hey, I'm completely fine with that. Being a beat-em-up, your moveset is quite simple. You move a bit slow. It can be a bit annoying at times, but it's not too bad. Attacking is a little strange in this game. Instead of using a button to attack, you use the right analog stick. This is something I've only ever seen in one other game, Star Wars Obi-Wan, also on the original Xbox. In that game, the right analog stick controlled your lightsaber, and while it might take some getting used to, it was quite satisfying and led to some of the best lightsaber combat in any Star Wars game. That's another really underrated game. Similarly, while this might take some time getting used to, using the right analog stick for combat like this actually makes a lot of sense. In most games, you'd have to be facing an enemy to hit them, but here, you attack in the direction you point the stick, regardless of where Cooper is facing. Cooper does automatically face the closest enemy to him, but if you get surrounded, you can just attack in any direction you want without having to face them yourself. This works quite well and makes what would be just your standard button mashing combat just a little more interesting and engaging. I mean, they could have just done what every other game did and have you push X or something to attack, and no one would have batted an eye. But would that have been better? I think they made the right call to take a risk on an unconventional control method. I'd say the game is better for it. Unconventional control methods tend to get a lot of flack from people. Unfairly, I might add. People get used to how a majority of games control, so when a game decides to be creative with its control scheme, some people just can't handle it and label it as bad, when in reality, they've just failed to adapt. Star Fox Zero is a good example of this. I find people also fall into this trap with older games. Far too often do I see old games described as having bad controls, especially games like GoldenEye or Jet Force Gemini. They've gotten too used to modern shooters, and because these games don't control like modern shooters, they automatically have bad controls, ignoring that these games were designed around how they were controlled. It can be tricky to tell the difference between bad controls and unorthodox controls, but I find that it becomes easier to tell by actually trying to learn the controls, try to adapt to it, give it a chance. If you've actually learned how it works, and the design of the game works well with the controls, then chances are it has good controls. Now, just because you get good at bad controls doesn't mean they aren't bad. And this is where it still is tricky determining what controls good or bad. But generally, a game controls well when the game is designed around those controls. For an example of bad controls, there's a Bubsy 3D. The design of the game is not at all complemented by the tank controls it has, with collectibles spread out in ways that makes picking them up a slower and more tedious process than what it should be. and the level design is not suited to these controls, like having you navigate long corridors full of turrets at 90-degree turns. Now, an example of good controls is Resident Evil 4. That game also uses tank controls, but the game is designed well around that, not requiring you to do precise platforming. That game also required you to stop in place to be able to aim and shoot, but again, the enemies are designed around that. They move slowly and have telegraphed attacks, so if you get hit, it's your fault, not the controls. I bring this up because the controls in Grabbed by the Ghoulies seem to have been a sticking point for some people, and anytime I see someone complain about using the right analog stick to attack, they just dismiss it as bad without elaborating why it's bad. And it really feels like they've failed to adapt, or didn't even try to adapt.
Perhaps the biggest functional problem with Grabbed by the Ghoulies is its control scheme. You attack by holding the right analog stick in the direction you wish to attack, almost like a twin-stick shooter. And that works for a twin-stick shooter. In a game like this, it's just not ideal.
Except why is it not ideal? How is it a problem? You haven't explained why, and he doesn't in the rest of that video. He just declared it not to be ideal without qualifying it. This is why I don't like these super short reviews. The only downside to using the right analog stick to attack is that you don't have it for camera control. Instead, you use the triggers to move it. But that's only a minor downside. It works fine, it shows you everything you need to see, and the game is built with it in mind. Sure, it'd be nice to be able to look around in all directions, but it isn't needed, so it isn't a problem. Sometimes in tighter spaces, the camera can be a little awkward, but it isn't a big deal, and can easily be corrected by, moving either the camera or yourself. It's not that hard. I swear people can be such babies when it comes to cameras. But to actually talk about the combat, as I said, the right analog stick controls the direction you're punching. Push it once in a direction to do a single hit, and hold it to do a combo if it connects with an enemy. His standard attacks do 1 point of damage, but at the end of a combo, or if an enemy is stunned, you will do a single stronger attack for 10 points of damage that has a bit of wind-up and has more knockback. In a crowd, it can be good for getting everyone off you. If the enemy is on the ground, you'll do a kick or elbow drop for 5 points of damage. It also has increased knockback, and you can potentially hit enemies into fire to instantly kill them. But because of the wind-up on both of these, you need to be careful, as you'll be vulnerable to other enemies nearby. You also will always perform one of these stronger attacks to finish off enemies. In addition to your bare hands, you can also pick up temporary weapons, which are just objects like chairs, bottles, barrels, etc. These are only temporary because they will break after a few hits. There are 4 types of weapons. There's the melee weapons. They basically just act as a knockback attack that you can use 3 times before it breaks. Also does 10 points of damage. Really useful for crowd control. There's throwable weapons, where you simply throw it once and it's gone. It only does 5 damage, but can hit multiple enemies and can be quite useful in some crowded areas. Next are multi-throw weapons, where you pick up a bunch of small objects and throw them one at a time. You get 6 throws, and they each do 5 damage. And in rare situations, you will have a table or sofa you can use as a weapon by spinning it around, hitting everything close to you for 30 damage. It's a one-time use, but a very effective one. Weapons are a nice addition to spice up combat and can make quite a difference in a lot of situations. Only complaint I have is you can't put them down. You can discard them, but they get destroyed in the process. So you can't say, put down a melee weapon to pick up a throwable, to then get the melee weapon again. It's minor, but it's still a little annoying. Also, if you get knocked back by an enemy, any weapon you may have had is instantly destroyed, which can be quite annoying. Now, there's also permanent weapons. Well, they're called permanent, but you can only use them at specific times when one of the NPCs gives it to you. After a set amount of rooms, they'll take them back. While you have them, you can't break them, but they can only be used so much before they need to recharge. There's a candle, which is the only purely melee-based one, the fire extinguisher, water gun, soda pop gun, and 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺. Aside from just being more effective at defeating enemies in general, these are primarily used to kill specific enemies faster, or are the only way to kill them at all. The candle is used against the mummies, who are only defeated by fire. The fire extinguisher is used against fire imps. The water gun is full of holy water and can kill zombies very quickly. 𝘴𝘱𝘰𝘬𝘺 shoots garlic, so it's the only way to defeat vampires. And the soda pop gun is just a strong projectile. Nothing is specifically weak to it. You can also use all the projectile-based ones as a melee weapon, which is helpful. These are pretty neat and add even more spice to the combat. Some of them aren't used all that often, like the candle and fire extinguisher, but those are only for one enemy each, so there's not much of a point to keep using them. Generally, when you have one of these, you are a lot stronger, but you still need to be careful not to overuse them so you don't become vulnerable. I don't really have any complaints about them, they're pretty fun to use. But this isn't all the options you have. There are also super soups, which are temporary power-ups you can find around the place or in objects. These are quite helpful and come in several types. There's the energy boost, which heals you for whatever it's listed as. Super weapons, which makes it so weapons won't break for a limited time, and you get infinite throwable weapons during all that as well. And the permanent weapons can also be used infinitely during this. Turbo Cooper, which increases your speed. Knockout Mania, which makes every attack a knockback attack. Invulnerability, which is self-explanatory. Freeze Ghoulies, which stops any enemies from moving. Invisibility, which is also self-explanatory. One Hit Wonder, which will instantly defeat any enemy in one hit, including from weapons. Miniature Cooper, which summons a smaller Cooper to help fight alongside you, and Traitor Frenzy, which makes all enemies attack each other instead of you. Sometimes enemies will actually start off friendly and attack each other without this power-up, which can be fun. There are a few other soups, which I'll go over when talking about the things they affect, but those are the main ones. You can tell what they do by the symbol above them, though there are 3 negative ones that share the same symbol. They can make you slower, reverse your controls, or drain your HP to 1. I find it's a good idea to just pick up the bad ones if nothing is going on and waiting for the effect to wear off so you don't have to worry about accidentally getting them during a battle. With these soups, it opens up more strategy to fights. You need to know when the best time to pick them up is, because if you waste them, they're gone. All of these things give enough options to make the combat pretty interesting, and it helps prevent it from getting too repetitive. Now there's quite a variety of ghoulies you'll be facing, each offering different tactics to the fight. Imps are the first enemies you encounter, and they're rather pathetic alone, but can prove to be a nuisance in larger numbers, or when other stronger ghoulies are nearby. Imps will just deal chip damage to you, no combos or knockout attacks, though later in the game they can make their head grow bigger and jump on your back to attack. You need to shake them off. They will sometimes react to you defeating other enemies. It can be a bit difficult to hit imps without getting hit, as their attacks are pretty fast, even if they hardly do any damage. There are a few other types of imps, like the flying ones, but they're pretty simple. The ninja imps can do a flying kick and can be rather difficult in groups. Spiders are very similar to imps, but have more wind-up to their attacks, so they're the easiest enemy in the game. Vampire chickens are also fairly simple, having the same attack where they jump on your back, but since they're vampires, you'll need old Edna to beat them. Though they can start as normal chickens, and you can defeat them before they turn into vampires. Speaking of vampires, they aren't very common, but they can be annoying since you can't hit them if the coffin is closed. And to get them to open, you need to get near them. And sometimes they just don't open. Skeletons are a common enemy and probably the most versatile. They can hit multiple times and do knockout attacks. They react to you defeating other enemies like the imps, but more importantly, they can use weapons just like you. They'll stand there with a light bulb over their head. Once it lights up, they'll move towards a weapon to use against you. And this can be rather dangerous, especially if they have a projectile, though you can prevent it by hitting them before they get to the weapon. You could also destroy any weapons you find, if for whatever reason you wouldn't want to use one. Oftentimes skeletons will already have weapons when you enter the room. Mummies are the first enemies you fight that you need a specific weapon to defeat. You can't even use the one-hit wonder soup. As stated before, you need the candle, but you only have the candle in a couple instances, so most of the time you have to avoid the mummies. You can still defeat mummies if there's a fire source nearby though. Same with the cursed mummies, but they have the ability to curse you. If that happens, you only have 30 seconds to either defeat it or leave the room before you instantly die. You can avoid the curse as it moves slowly, but you still don't want to even let them send it off, so defeat them as soon as possible. Zombies are a common enemy. They're straightforward, but they tend to do this attack where they spin their arms, and they won't stop approaching until they hit you or you hit them. You can avoid their attack by getting close to them, but it's a bit hard to not get hit. When they do this attack, they drop their arm, and you can use that as a weapon. Zombie pirates are a little tougher. They can sometimes drop their sword, which you can use as a weapon, but also sometimes they'll bring out a treasure chest to throw at you. Worms are simple enemies. You hit them and they'll blow up after a few seconds, but you can just kick them away. There are several haunted objects, from chairs, paintings, and coats. The coats can be a bit annoying since they're pretty fast. The haunted TVs can summon other ghoulies ghoulies and electrocute themselves, making it hard to hit them without hurting yourself. And sometimes you have to fight haunted doors, and these guys can be rather tough. The game kind of treats them like a boss of sorts. Same with the hunchbacks. They just run away from you, and you can't hurt them unless you hit their face, which can be a little hard at times if they go into a corner. Sometimes they curl up like this, and when they do, if you hit them enough, they'll attack back. Can be difficult to avoid, and they seem to just stay like that until you hit them, so you need to make sure you're good at avoiding that attack. Medusas are interesting since they don't go after you, only attacking if you get close, which is hard to avoid. They have this green vision that you need to avoid. It causes a super scary shock, which I'll talk about later. It's best to hit them from behind when they're doing this. Warlocks are special enemies that hide in furniture, and you need to find them to start the fight. They teleport around and fire projectiles. It can be annoying if they teleport across the room, but that's why you throw things at them. And lastly, there's Jesse and Clyde, probably the toughest enemy to fight head-on. At first, it's passive until you attack it or get too close, but when it's active, it does a lot of damage, and it can charge at you and throw you across the room, which is difficult to avoid. Also can create a scare, which I'll also talk about later. This is probably the only enemy I just don't like, because it's just annoying to fight head-on. He is hard to avoid and can briefly be invincible. Most of the time the best way to fight it is by throwing things at it, though in some places it can't go to certain parts of the room, so you can attack it, then run to where it's safe and repeat. But doing this is just kind of boring. I wouldn't say it's a bad enemy, I just don't like fighting it. Overall, the enemy selection is rather strong, each one bringing its own flavor. There aren't really any redundant enemies. You see an enemy and you know what to expect, and a lot of the challenge from combat is how they mix the enemies together. If all this game was the combat mechanics in these enemies, I'd say it's a fairly strong system. Maybe in danger of being repetitive if it went on too long, but you could say that about any combat-focused game. However, that isn't all there is to this game, or even the combat. So let's talk about the rest of the game. The progression in this game is very simple. You go from room to room in a linear order, fighting ghoulies along the way. This isn't a game like Luigi's Mansion where you can move around the mansion however you like and go back to rooms you cleared. Once you finish a room, you can't go back to it at any time. Each room is its own challenge. You enter a room and can't leave the room until you've completed whatever the challenge that room has. When the challenge is complete, all you can do is move on to the next room. Can't go backwards. Now you will sometimes revisit rooms, but when you do, you have an all-new challenge to face. Even though it's the same room, it isn't the same level. So as I said, each room has its own challenge. Well, not every room, as some have a door to the next room open that you're free to go through without doing any challenge. But most of the time, the door will be locked by a question mark, and to get it open, you must reach the requirements for the challenge. There are several types of challenges you must complete. Obviously, there's defeat all the enemies in the room, but they get more creative than that most of the time. You may be tasked with defeating all of a specific type of enemy, or a specific number of enemies. Either with any enemy or with specific types of enemies. There's also Survive, which only requires you to stay alive for the amount of time. Defeating enemies is optional. But there's also Find the Key, which can either be inside furniture or a specific enemy is carrying it. You can destroy most objects in the environment, which is satisfying, but also how you find the keys if that's the challenge. It's also how you can find more weapons or super soups. Those are the tasks you have to complete, but sometimes you have to do more than one task at a time. Sometimes you may complete a task, but then you get a second task. Sometimes you can find a challenge complete soup, which just automatically beats the challenge for you. It's not all that common, but can be handy in some tougher challenges. In addition to these tasks, you have rules you must follow or you will suffer the consequences. You may have a time limit to complete the task. You may not be allowed to defeat specific enemies or any enemies at all, or aren't allowed to take any damage. You may be forced to not use any weapons, or be forced to only use weapons. There's also one where you have a limited amount of attacks that you are allowed to perform, and one where you can't cause any damage to the environment. Now the most interesting one is where you can't defeat the same type of enemies 2 times in a row. Now that's a lot of rules and restrictions. That sounds a little annoying, doesn't it? Well, this is actually probably the coolest thing they do. You don't instantly die or have to redo a challenge if you break a rule. Instead, it summons the Reaper. The Reaper will spawn in, usually near the entrance or exit, and immediately move towards you with his arm extended. The Reaper cannot be defeated, and if his hand touches you, you will die instantly. This is a punishment for breaking the rules, but you can still recover from it. You can still clear the challenge with him there. The only punishment is if he gets you. You can avoid him, and just like every other enemy, you can attack him and knock him down. Doing so without a weapon is difficult, but you can do it. In rare situations, you could even knock him out a window to permanently get rid of him for that room. It's the only way to defeat him. There's also the Dizzy Reaper soups, which will stun the Reaper when you pick them up, giving you a lot of time to deal with the challenge. But actually, there's even a benefit to having the Reaper around, because not only does he kill you in one hit, he can kill enemies in one hit as well. Even ones like the mummies or vampires that require specific weapons or hazards to beat at all. Not only is that useful in that it kills the enemy, it also makes the Reaper do this animation, which gives you time to get away. And there are some challenges that require the Reaper to appear, like this one where you need to kill a vampire, which is otherwise invincible, or this one where you need to avoid him for a full minute. The Reaper is a much more interesting system than if you just failed instantly upon breaking a rule. It's simultaneously punishing and lenient. It is an instant kill enemy, but one that can be avoided and used against other enemies, which gives it a risk versus reward factor towards it. If a specific enemy or challenge is giving you trouble, summon the Reaper and have him kill that enemy. Sometimes the rules of the room are a little restrictive, and you'd rather just be able to deal with the challenge your way, even if it means risking the Reaper. The Reaper is a really smart mechanic and really adds a lot to this game. The game would already be good without him, but it would still be quite a bit worse without him. And I'm not exaggerating. All this into consideration, the combat mechanics, the weapon system, the soups, the enemy variety, and the challenges all make for one really varied experience. Each room is a tailor-made challenge that tests you in various ways. How good you are with this arrangement of enemies, with this set of requirements or restrictions, with whatever weapons or soups are available. Because of this, the game doesn't ever get to the point of feeling repetitive. I've seen people accuse this game of being repetitive, which I simply don't understand. Sure, the combat mechanics stay the same, but that's usually true for every game. And this one varies it up all the time with the different combinations of challenges and rules among everything else. What I also don't get is when they complain about it being repetitive and then go on to say the game is too short. Like, surely if it's too repetitive, wouldn't the problem be that it's too long? Anyways, this game has enough variety in its challenges to avoid being repetitive. Now, to mention a couple other things that I haven't brought up yet. Early on in the game, Baron von Ghoul will actually mess with your health. Normally you have a max of 50 HP, but the Baron will change how much health you start with when you enter a room, and how much you have is room specific. So the challenges are designed around that specific amount of health. On one hand, this allows for even more specifically controlled challenges based on the amount of health you're given. Some rooms will give you 1 HP at the start, effectively making the challenge based on not getting hit. But on the other hand, that means there really isn't any long-term reason for managing your health. You could ace a hard challenge without taking any damage, or get your face smashed in and barely leave alive, and it would be no different once you've entered the next room. I think overall there's more good to this than bad, but it is something to consider that health management isn't really a thing here. Now, in moving around rooms, sometimes a ghost or something will appear. When this happens, you only have a couple seconds to get away before a red orb appears, and if you're caught in it, Cooper will get scared. This makes it so he moves slow and can't attack for a few seconds, but also he'll take double damage during it. These are kinda neat. It's an environmental hazard you need to avoid, but sometimes that can be in inconvenient locations. The Jesse and Clyde enemy can do this as an attack as well, and if that happens, you'll be taking quite a bit of damage. And then there's the super scary shocks. Every once in a while, you'll essentially get jump scared by some random creature that appears. The Medusas can also do it. Now, they aren't likely to actually make you jump. They are rather tame, but when it happens, you need to push all the buttons on screen or you'll take damage. The farther in the game you go, the more buttons you'll need to push. There's a soup that automatically hits all the buttons for you, and it doesn't wear off until you leave the room, so if there are multiple shocks in the room, they're all nullified. I don't think this mechanic really adds anything to the game. They're essentially QuickTime events, which I've never liked, though they are pretty easy. It just kinda wastes time, and doesn't add much challenge. At least the smaller scares added something, these not so much. Though for some reason, I just find it funny the way Cooper reacts to them, but then just shrugs it off when you hit all the buttons, and this creature just goes away. You don't fight any of these things, they're only there to spook you. The second room in the game is this hallway with mounted heads that Cooper will automatically go through. You have no control here, and some of the heads will do a shock on you. I believe which ones do it is different every playthrough, which is neat, but other than that, kind of a pointless room. I guess by default, this is the worst room in the game, which all things considered is a good sign. Thankfully, they don't do any more rooms like this. So the game is divided between 5 chapters, each with their own goal, but the objective makes little difference gameplay-wise. All it really determines is what rooms you'll be going through. Chapter 1 is just saving Amber, but you don't do anything to save her other than getting to the room where she is. Chapter 2 is about getting the 3 ingredients to turn Amber back to normal, but the fact that you need to get 3 things doesn't really mean anything. You don't choose where to go, you can't get them out of order. The game is very linear, so it's not like finding them requires exploration. Same for Chapter 3, where you're finding the 3 pieces of the riddle to confront the Baron. Now, this isn't a complaint at all. Being linear isn't a problem. It's just a little weird how it's divided. You do go to different parts of the mansion, to be fair, but that's about it. At the end of Chapter 2, you get a boss fight with Ghoulie Amber, and this fight is kind of annoying. You fight her like you'd fight any other Ghoulie, but she attacks fast, does a lot of damage, and can combo you while you're on the floor, which is basically instant death that you can't do much to avoid. It is really hard to hit her head on because of how fast she attacks, so projectiles are the best bet. But it's just not all that fun to fight. But besides the Baron, that's the only boss in the game, which is weird. You'd think Dr. Crackpot would be a boss, but no, he's just defeated in a cutscene. Kinda a missed opportunity. I feel like there was a lot more potential for bosses. Chapter 4 is entirely the fight against the Baron, which is also weird, but at least his fight is pretty good. You have a big arena to fight him, and he'll roam around attacking if you get close. You can't hurt him. Every time you attack him, he gets angry and attacks back. But after the 3rd time, he gets dizzy, which lets you knock him down. When this happens, you can now pick up his weapon and use it against him, which is how you can actually hurt him. It may not be the most obvious that's how to do it, since you don't deal any damage and the first 2 times you do it, he just attacks back. But I feel like him having a reaction like that is enough of a tell that you're doing the right thing. When you have his weapon, he'll attempt to run from you. Just like every other weapon, it breaks after 3 hits, and you need to make sure to hit him when he's not glowing red, otherwise it won't hurt him. After a few hits, he'll unveil his secret weapon, the Red Baron, for Phase 2. During this phase, he'll charge at you and hit the walls. He gives you a soda pop gun during this phase. At this point, it's as simple as dodging his attacks, then hitting him after he's hit a wall. He will summon some ghoulies in between this, but with the soda pop gun, they're easy to take care of. It's a cool fight. Not amazing, or even the best Rare has ever made, but it still is a good boss, and makes me wish this game had more bosses. But beating the Baron isn't the end. Chapter 5 is also unique. You need to save all of the trapped teenagers. Throughout the mansion, you'll occasionally see one of them locked up. Crivens mentions needing the key that the Baron has, and I spent the whole game wondering how you would go about saving them since you can't backtrack at all. They seemed like they'd be an optional thing you could do, but no, they're saved for the end. And it's not all that different from the rest of the game. You go to a room and Mr. Ribs will save them for you, and then you do a challenge in that room. The main difference is you have a time limit. You need to do all the challenges here before the time runs out. You also can't save in the middle of this. It's not that hard to do as long as you don't waste too much time. After you save everyone, Cooper gets knocked out, and the last bit of gameplay is playing as Ma Soupswill fighting a horde of imps. She plays just like Cooper and has a big spoon that doesn't break to use as a weapon. It's strange that at the very end you get to play as a new character. I wonder if more sections like this may have been planned and cut. Would have been cool to play as all the other NPCs. After beating the game, you are actually ranked. There are 4 categories: time, enemies defeated, deaths, and hostages saved. They're all on a scale of 25, and as far as I know, it doesn't really affect anything. It's just like Luigi's Mansion, just for bragging rights, I suppose, which is fine. At first, I thought it was weird that saving the hostages was one of the categories, since I assumed that if you ran out of time, you'd have to redo it all, which would mean you'd have to save everyone. I thought that perhaps this was a situation where originally the hostages were supposed to be an optional objective, but time restraints meant they repurposed them for the finale, but didn't remove them from the scoring system. But I looked into it, and it just seems that if you run out of time, you just can't save the rest, and that's your score. Bit more boring, I suppose, but makes sense. Though I still do wonder if they were always meant to be like this. Now there is one thing I didn't mention. What would a Rareware game be without collectibles? In every single room there is one block you can find. Entering a room you've already completed before acts like a new room, so a book will be found there. Books can be out in the open or in furniture, and rarely dropped by an enemy. They aren't too hard to find most of the time. Some can be tricky, but generally as long as you break all the furniture, defeat all the enemies, and keep a watchful eye out, you'll find them no problem. Sometimes the book won't be available right away, requiring you to complete a challenge first. Usually because the enemy who has the book only spawns afterwards, or they break out of a container that has the book in it. As long as you don't leave the room before getting the book, you'll be fine. As if you do, there's no way to get it again. You're locked out of it for the playthrough. What's annoying is there are a handful of rooms that once you complete the challenge, you automatically get sent to the next room. So if you tend to wait until after you've completed a challenge to search for the book, you may miss a few. But luckily, after you beat the game, you are able to replay any room in the game, and it tracks what books you have. So if you don't have one in a room, you can just get it this way, which is rather nice since there's no way to permanently lose a book. This is also nice for Chapter 5, so you can just skip the books there and get them later without having a time limit. What the books do is every 5 collected gives you an extra bonus challenge you can play. These are score-based challenges. It's stuff like defeat as many skeletons before time runs out, see how long you can avoid taking damage from imps, see how many buttons you can push during a super scary shock in the time limit, defeat all enemies while taking as little damage as possible, see how long you can protect Fiddlesworth, and see how long you can survive against 3 Reapers. Stuff like that. Some of these you actually play as Amber. These are neat additions, but I've never been too fond of score-based challenges, so they don't do much for me. But it's still good nonetheless. You can get bronze, silver, or gold rank depending on how you perform, and there's even a hidden platinum you can get. If you manage to get at least a gold on all 20 challenges, you can unlock a secret 21st challenge called Play It Again, Son. This challenge is basically the hard mode. You have to play the whole game over, but you're Amber instead of Cooper. Instead of the varied health you get per room normally, Amber always starts with a max of 10 HP, which can make some rooms easier, but most of the time it's harder. Along with that, there are no super soups anywhere in the game. It's cool that there's a hard mode. Some rooms can be quite fun to try and survive in with the limited health, and it's cool to be able to play the whole game as Amber. But unfortunately, I find it's just not as interesting as the main game. The lack of soups really takes away from the game. There's less strategy without them. Sure, it is harder, but making you play the same game, but also taking away a whole component to the battle system just makes the battle system less interesting. I feel like it'd be better if all the challenges were changed up to make them harder. Different requirements, different combinations of ghoulies, stuff like that, and I understand that might be a bit unreasonable since it basically doubles the content of the game, but as it is, this is just an okay mode at best. I didn't finish it because, in all honesty, while it is harder, it isn't significantly harder. And with the soups removed, it's just a less interesting, slightly tougher version of the game. This also makes the Ghoulie Amber boss just annoying since you die in one hit. This was one of the few times it did feel significantly harder from the main game, but it wasn't all that fun. It's neat that there is a hard mode, but it could have been handled a lot better. It doesn't take anything away from the game though, so I can't be too harsh on it. It isn't even bad, just underwhelming. And that is Grabbed by the Ghoulies, a really fun and creative beat-em-up that doesn't get enough attention. Hardly anyone even talks about this game. It might be one of the more obscure Rare games out there, and I find that to be a shame because this is a damn good game. But the problem is, this was the first game Rare made for the Xbox, and a lot of Rare fans at the time were Nintendo fans, and they weren't happy with the buyout. You've heard it before, people constantly complaining about post-Nintendo Rare. They keep complaining about how either Microsoft ruined Rare or Rare lost its touch after going to Microsoft. And then every Microsoft-era Rare game was called bad or not on par with the previous games. And I do have my issues with post-Microsoft Rare, especially with how certain franchises were handled, or just not utilized at all. But I feel a lot of people were not fair to Rare at all during this time. Almost like they wanted their games to be bad. I still believe the N64 era Rare was their peak, but that doesn't mean everything after is garbage. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is a perfect example of a really good Microsoft era Rare game. The combat is well done and well thought out. The challenges and all the combinations they come in keep the game fresh. And the Reaper is a damn near genius mechanic. There really isn't a low point to the game, or at least not a significant one. The quick time events hardly get in the way, and while the hard mode isn't amazing, 1, it's optional, and 2, as I said, it's not even a bad mode. The art style is really good, the soundtrack is great, the characters are fun. I don't really get what's not to like here. Sure, the controls are different, but if you'd bother to make an attempt to learn them, you'd find they work quite well. The game isn't as repetitive as some claim, and while it is a rather short game, it's not too short, and it makes good use out of the time you get. So that's not a problem either. People have been unreasonably harsh to this game, and I'll say this is one of the most underrated Rare games, or just games in general. But there are fans of this game who have given it a fair shot, and, well, I'm right with them. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is pretty damn good, and a perfect game for Halloween.
Stupid dog! You made me look bad!
Hey, thanks for watching. I know this is shorter than my more recent reviews, but I felt I needed a bit of a break from Paper Mario. Those have been rather draining to make with how big they ended up. Don't worry, I will continue them. Just wanted to do something smaller in between, and what better than this game for Halloween. I also wanted to push myself to get this done for Halloween. The entire review process for this was during this month. Probably the fastest I've made a review. But anyways, I want to thank my patrons, IKG Productions, The SideQuest Gamer, Tanuki, and Enemy. Thanks for the support, guys, and if you feel I deserve it, please consider supporting me on Patreon.